Good afternoon, generals, and welcome to new episode of Men Around the Führer. There's a peculiar irony in the story I'm about to tell you. It's about a man who loved music, who could discuss Franz Liszt and Franz Lehar with genuine passion, who was described as having refined artistic tastes and a sensitive soul. And yet, this same man would become known by one of the most chilling titles to emerge from the Nuremberg trials, the Banker of Gold Teeth. His name was Walther Funk. And if you don't know it as well as you know Goering or Himmler, well, that's exactly how he wanted it. Let me take you back to August 18th, 1890. In a small town called Danskemmen, near Trakenen in East Prussia, a boy was born into a merchant family. The region is part of Russia now, but back then it was the heartland of the German Empire. Young Walter grew up surrounded by the rhythms of commerce and trade, watching his father build a business, learning the language of money and markets. But what really captured his heart was music. His great-uncle was Alfred Reisenauer, a celebrated pianist who had studied under Franz Liszt himself. Imagine family gatherings where one of Europe's finest pianists would play, where music wasn't just entertainment, but a religion. This cultural sophistication would stay with Funk his entire life, even as he descended into the machinery of evil. When World War I broke out, Funk joined the infantry like so many young German men, but his body wouldn't cooperate. Chronic bladder problems, they said. In 1916, he was discharged as unfit for service. Some men might have felt shame, but Funk felt relief. He wasn't a warrior. He was something else entirely. He went to university in Berlin and Leipzig, where he studied everything: law, economics, philosophy, even literature. He earned his doctorate in law in 1912, but it was journalism that called to him. The written word, the power to shape opinion, to explain the complex world of finance to ordinary people. By 1922, he'd become editor-in-chief of the Berliner Börsenzeitung, one of Germany's leading financial newspapers. He was good at it, really good. His articles appeared in specialized magazines across the country. He spoke at international conferences. He became one of Germany's most respected voices on economic matters. He married in 1920 to Luise Schmidt-Sieben, daughter of an entrepreneur. On the surface, everything looked respectable, successful, and normal. But Germany was bleeding. The Weimar Republic was drowning in the chaos of hyperinflation, political violence, and the humiliation of Versailles. And Funk, nationalist that he was, anti-Marxist to his core, was looking for answers, looking for someone who could make sense of it all. In the spring of 1931, everything changed. Funk met Adolf Hitler. Later, he would say that Hitler made a profound impression on him. Hitler knew exactly what men like Funk needed to hear. "Don't worry," he told the respectable Economist. "We're not going to implement some crazy socialist program. We're not going to destroy capitalism. In fact, you can help us create our economic policy." It was intoxicating. Here was this dynamic movement, this promise of national renewal, and they wanted him, his expertise, his connections. On June 1st, 1931, Walther Funk joined the Nazi Party. And this is where the story gets interesting, because Funk brought something invaluable to the Nazis: legitimacy. He had connections with the Ruhrlade, a powerful group of 12 major industrialists. He knew the bankers, the business leaders, the people who controlled Germany's money, and he could speak their language. He became Hitler's personal economic advisor and served as the middleman between Hitler and German industry. When the Nazis needed funding or needed to reassure nervous capitalists, they sent Funk, the sophisticated journalist, the man who understood both worlds. In July 1932, he was elected to the Reichstag. When the Nazis seized power in 1933, Funk stepped down from parliament and moved into something more hands-on. Joseph Goebbels made him chief press officer of the Reich, then state secretary at the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Funk now controlled what Germans could read, hear, and watch. The censorship of anything critical of Nazi policies flowed through his office. One colleague testified at Nuremberg that Funk was the soul of the ministry, and that Goebbels called him "my most efficient man." He held daily meetings with the Führer. He issued the directives that every newspaper in Germany had to follow. But Funk wanted more. He had his eye on something bigger. In November 1937, Hjalmar Schacht resigned as Minister of Economics. Schacht was brilliant and principled, but he had clashed with Hitler and Goering over excessive military spending. He saw bankruptcy coming, so he got out. In February 1938, Hitler appointed Funk as his replacement. Think about that for a moment. The artistic, music-loving journalist was now in charge of the entire German economy. And then, in January 1939, Hitler gave him Schacht's other position too, president of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank. Walther Funk now controlled the purse strings of the Third Reich. Schacht, who knew Funk well, watched this with a mixture of pity and horror. He once described Funk as extraordinarily musical, a first-rate connoisseur of music, whose personal preferences in life were decidedly for the artistic and literary. At a dinner, when the orchestra played Lehar, Funk mentioned that Hitler loved this music. Schacht joked, "It's a pity that Lehar is married to a Jewess." Funk's immediate response, "That's something the Führer must not know on any account." Even in casual conversation, you could see it. Funk knew what Hitler was, and he protected that knowledge carefully, always. Now let me tell you what Funk did with his new power. On November 12, 1938, just days after Kristallnacht, the night when Nazi thugs destroyed Jewish businesses and synagogues across Germany, Funk attended a crucial meeting. Goering chaired it. They discussed the Jewish question, and Funk proposed a decree. Jews should be banned from all business activities. Goering signed it the same day. Funk later boasted that by 1938, the German state had seized Jewish property worth 2 million marks. But that word, seized, is too clean, too bureaucratic. Let me be clear, this was theft. Jews were forced to pay for the damage the Nazis had done to their own property. They were stripped of their wealth, their businesses, their livelihoods, and when they tried to emigrate, to flee, they were taxed on what little they had left. At Nuremberg, Funk would admit to signing these laws. He claimed to be morally guilty, but insisted he had no choice. He was just following orders, but it gets worse, so much worse. As the war began, Funk threw himself into planning for conquest. His office sent memorandums about using prisoners of war for labor. He attended meetings about financing the war. On August 25, 1939, just days before Germany invaded Poland, Funk wrote a letter to Hitler expressing his gratitude for being able to participate in such world-shaking events. World-shaking events, that's what he called them. In August 1939, Hitler appointed Funk to the Council of Ministers for Defense of the Reich, a 6-person war cabinet. Funk was responsible for military and economic affairs. He attended dozens of crucial meetings. He helped plan the economic exploitation of conquered territories. When Goering told occupation chiefs it didn't matter if their people starved, Funk was in the room. But here's the thing that would haunt him forever, the thing that would earn him that terrible nickname. In 1942, Funk entered into an agreement with Heinrich Himmler. The Reichsbank would receive gold, jewels, and currency from the SS. Funk instructed his subordinates not to ask too many questions. Just accept the deliveries, process them, and don't be curious. The SS began sending shipments to the Reichsbank. Gold coins, foreign currency, jewelry, watches, eyeglasses, and gold teeth. Gold teeth extracted from the corpses of murdered Jews in concentration camps. It was deposited in what they called the Max Heiliger account. The coins and banknotes went into circulation. The jewelry went to Berlin pawnshops, and the gold from the eyeglasses and the teeth, that was stored in the Reichsbank's vaults. At Nuremberg, Funk protested that he didn't know what was being received, but the tribunal didn't believe him. How could he not know? The SS guards delivering it, the sheer volume, the obvious origin of personal effects. As the tribunal's judgment stated, Funk either knew what was being received or was deliberately closing his eyes to what was being done. The American chief prosecutor, Robert Jackson, gave him that label that would stick forever, the banker of gold teeth. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? To be reduced to that single damning phrase? The man who loved Liszt and Lehar, who prided himself on his cultural sophistication, would be remembered for processing the gold fillings ripped from the mouths of murdered human beings. As the war ground on, Funk's influence waned. By 1943, he was sidelined from major decisions. He drank heavily. His health deteriorated. When Germany collapsed in May 1945, he was captured by American troops. At Nuremberg, the contrast between Funk's self-image and reality became painfully clear. He was accused on all 4 counts of the indictment: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and waging aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He argued that despite his impressive titles, he had very little real power. He was just a functionary. A small man, he said, who was frequently allowed up to the door but not in. Even Goering tried to help him, calling Funk an insignificant subordinate. But the documents told a different story. His own wartime biography, Walther Funk, A Life for the Economy, laid out his role in undeniable detail. The signatures on the anti-Jewish decrees, the minutes from the meetings, the letters expressing gratitude for being part of history. During the trial, Funk broke down repeatedly. He cried when evidence of concentration camp murders was presented. He needed sleeping pills to get through the nights. Albert Speer, watching him, felt pity. Schacht, sitting near him, thought Funk simply couldn't comprehend the serious nature of what he'd done. On October 1st, 1946, the verdict came down. Guilty on counts 2, 3, and 4. Sentenced to life imprisonment. Funk's knees buckled when he heard the sentence. He could barely walk out of the courtroom. He was sent to Spandau prison in West Berlin, along with 6 other convicted Nazis: Rudolf Hess, Albert Speer, and Karl Dönitz. The men who had once ruled an empire were now prisoners in a fortress jail, guarded in rotation by American, British, French, and Soviet soldiers. For 11 years, Funk lived in that cell while his health, never robust, continued to fail. The diabetes, the bladder problems, the psychological weight of what he'd done, or what he'd allowed to happen, or what he'd chosen not to see. In May 1957, citing medical grounds, the authorities released him. He was 66 years old and had served 11 years of his life sentence. He moved to Düsseldorf and lived in obscurity for 3 years. That's all he got. On May 31st, 1960, Walther Funk died. No crowds mourned him. No memorials were built. The man who once sat at Hitler's table, who controlled Germany's economy, who signed documents that destroyed lives, simply faded away. But his story doesn't end with his death, because Walther Funk represents something we need to understand. He wasn't a street brawler like Julius Streicher or a fanatic like Alfred Rosenberg. He wasn't even particularly ideological. He was respectable, educated, and cultured. He loved music and had refined taste. He could have said no at any point, could have resigned like Schacht, could have refused the agreement with Himmler, could have asked questions about those SS shipments, but he didn't. He chose to close his eyes, chose to ignore what was inconvenient, chose to keep climbing and maintain his power so he could stay in the room where history was being made. And that choice, that passive complicity, that willingness to not ask questions when the answers might be inconvenient, made him guilty. Not just legally guilty, but morally guilty in a way that all his cultural sophistication couldn't erase. The banker of gold teeth, that's his legacy. Not his articles on monetary policy, not his knowledge of Liszt, not his refined aesthetic sense, just gold teeth, ripped from the mouths of the dead, flowing through his bank and funding the machinery of genocide. And here's what keeps me awake at night. Funk wasn't a monster in the way we imagine monsters. He was ordinary, ambitious, weak, and human, which means any of us, in the wrong circumstances, with the wrong choices, with a willingness to not ask uncomfortable questions, could walk down that same path. That's the real horror of Walther Funk's story. Not that such men exist, but that such men could be us.